Hello, my dear brothers and sisters. Welcome to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. We are on part 20 today. The title of this one is The Church of the Desert. And while this might seem like it is going to be about the monastic movement, it is actually going to be about the Protestant movement in France. You may remember things had actually gotten a lot better for the Protestants in France when King Henry IV took the throne. Henry IV was a Protestant, but in order to secure his throne, he had to convert to Catholicism, or at least say that he did. And that left a lot of Catholics in France actually really not trusting him too much because they felt like he was probably still Protestant. One of the reasons they felt that way is he actually treated the Protestants well. So Protestants were doing well under Henry IV. The Treaty of Nantes had given them a measure of religious freedom. And so as long as Henry IV was in charge, Protestantism in France was going to do well. But of course, nobody's going to stay in charge forever. And actually, Henry IV was assassinated on May 14th, 1610. You can imagine that left French Protestants thinking, well, what's going to happen to us now? And at first it was okay. Although Henry had declared himself Catholic in order to secure the throne, he had continued to show tolerance and friendship toward the Protestants and had upheld the Treaty of Nantes. That treaty had allowed the Protestants to have religious freedom, at least some religious freedom. In order to keep that freedom, the Protestants knew the next ruler was going to have to want to uphold that and not take it down. Well, the new king was Louis XIII, but he was only 8 years old. So his mother, Marie de Medici, ruled in his place. And she took care of things until he was able to do it. She was able to allay mistrust among French Protestants by confirming the Treaty of Nantes. So when Marie came in, she said, no, we're going to stick to this treaty. So that was good. That meant as long as she was running things, she was going to kind of keep things status quo is what they wanted. But Marie gathered around her a group of Italian advisors who followed a policy of close collaboration with the Habsburgs. So the Habsburgs are very Catholic. They're not going to go along with Protestantism. But as long as Marie was in charge, she wasn't going to let them convince her to get rid of the Treaty of Nantes or not to follow it. But it was going to set things up so that when her son, Louis XIII, finally came into power, he was already going to be surrounded by these people who were not going to go along with that and were not going to want to help the Protestants. So it didn't turn out to be a great situation when it was all said and done, but it started out okay for the Protestants at least. The king eventually married the Spanish princess Anne of Austria, so that's another red flag for the Protestants. Spain is hyper-Catholic. They are, of all the nations in Europe, they are the least tolerant. And so bringing in somebody from Spain is not going to be a great thing for the Protestants, and they knew that. And it actually provoked several Protestant uprisings, which achieved only the death of a number of their leaders and the loss of several Protestant strongholds. So the Protestants thought we need to kind of try to get ahead of things before we're attacked. Not necessarily a terrible way of thinking, but unfortunately, they didn't have the resources to fight. And so it didn't achieve anything for them. They didn't gain any favor, probably actually lost some. And they lost some leadership that they could have used. They lost some strongholds that they had, which was their biggest asset. And so right off the bat, before things even turned against them, the Protestants could see the tide was going to turn eventually. They tried to be proactive, but they did it in a way that ultimately only hurt them. Toward 1622, Marie de Medici is losing her power. She's going to kind of have to go to the background because the king's going to come in. And that means there's going to be some new people that are going to come in and kind of fill that power vacuum. And one of the primary ones, was a cardinal that came in, and that was Cardinal Armand de Richelieu. And he was a rising star in the French court. He was a guy that was going to have a lot of influence, and he's going to wield a lot of power during the reign of King Louis XIII. Within 2 years, he had become the king's most trusted advisor. His main goal was to gain personal power. His religious policy followed that goal as well. He also wanted to uphold the power of the throne. He didn't want to take the throne. He wanted to support the throne so that the king would keep him in a good light. So he was going to be very strong to uphold the government and to uphold the king's power because it benefited him. And he would do that in civil matters or religious matters. It really didn't matter. So we see the same pattern that we've seen all for a long time now in Christianity. These leaders in the church, they weren't just looking out for religious things. It's one of the reasons that the doctrinal positions got to be such a mess. You've got people in high positions of power that have a lot of influence, not just on polity, but also on theological matters, on doctrinal matters. And there are people that are not primarily concerned with those things. They're more concerned with the matters of the state, civil matters, their own political power. And religious power was a means to an end to that. So those are not the best people that you want in place to make decisions about doctrinal issues. And yet that had gone on for a long time. And this is just one more guy in a long line of people that thought that way. Therefore, because he saw the Habsburgs as the biggest enemies of the French Bourbons, he intervened in the 30 Years' War on the side of Protestants and against the Catholic emperor. Here's a guy that is supposedly going to support Catholics. And Richelieu, when he saw that it would be to his advantage to go against Catholics in the 30 Years' War, he had no problem doing that. He was a Catholic. And he, should have been on the side of the church, but he wasn't. He's going to be on his own side and on the side of the king. So he said to himself, we're going to be in the best position to go against the ones that are Catholics in this conflict. And he had no problem doing that at all. It didn't mean that he in any way was on the side of the Protestants, as you'll see. He was not. It just meant that in that situation, it was better for him to be on their side than it was to be on the side of the Catholics. And it just goes back to that saying that you probably heard before, and we've definitely heard throughout this study, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So if I've got an enemy and there's another group out there that I would naturally be enemies with, but they're also an enemy of a bigger enemy of mine, then it's in my best interest to go ahead and just get on the same side as they are for that conflict. And so you've got Catholic and Protestant joining forces to go against another Catholic side, but it really only has to do with political power. And we see it time and time and time again. And it's not going to be any kind of precursor to the way this guy is going to handle Protestantism in his own country, as you'll see. But this policy was not the same in France. He saw the Protestants as a threat to the state that must be destroyed. Again, this does not have to do with religious issues. He doesn't care about heresy. He doesn't care about differences of opinion in religion. He doesn't care about doctrinal matters. None of that makes a difference. For Richelieu, what was going to be the difference maker was, would that group be would it help the king in his power, or would it be a detriment in some way, or could it possibly be? And he looked at the Protestants and he saw them as being actually a threat to the power of the king. Why is that? Well, his main objections were not theological, but political. Again, because of Henry IV's policies, the French Protestants were guaranteed several fortified cities. So remember, in that Treaty of Nantes, they were able to take, if they were in a city and established themselves, they could keep it. And several of those cities were very well fortified cities. So they had very good, strong defensive capabilities. And he didn't like that because it allowed the Protestants to do, while they might declare themselves to be servants of the crown, they also were able to retain the ability to rebel and resist if their rights were ever violated. So he just saw them as a potential threat. He saw out there, this group, if they wanted to, they could cause us problems. And that's just not something he was willing to deal with. He really wanted to centralize power and centralize policies in the nation. Again, when you look at this guy, he's not a bad guy in civil matters, but he is a bad guy in religious matters. He didn't need to be a cardinal. He should have been advisor to the king or Secretary of State or whatever it would be in France. I don't know what actual roles there were or positions, but that was that's what he served as. But the cardinal role shouldn't have had nothing to do with it. And he would have been a lot better remembered because he actually, even though he was out for his own good actually coincided with what was good for the king in power and in some ways the country as well. So Richelieu's not a bad guy in that role, but he's a terrible guy in the cardinal role. And so he's gonna go out against these Protestants because he sees them as a threat to wield some independent power in a state that he wants to get centralized under the government that he's working for. Well, that's going to lead to more religious wars in France, unfortunately. Richelieu's efforts led to armed action in the siege of La Rochelle, the main Protestant stronghold. So this was the one. He is smart again, because he knows if I can take La Rochelle out, then I don't have to worry about the other ones. I can get those. So while I'm at the height of my power, I have the strongest army. I've got all my forces. Let me go after this one. It'll be tough, but once I get it, then I can get the rest of it. It's a smart move on his part. The siege lasted a year before the city surrendered. So they were tough. That city was tough. And it shows you how well fortified they were. They were going up against the combined army of France. I mean, this is a big force that went after them. And there were no other wars going on really to speak of at that time. So they could put their efforts toward taking out this group. But they were able to actually last a year. But it cost them a lot. Of the original 25,000 inhabitants, look at this, only 1,500 survived. 1,500 out of 25,000. That's amazing. That is a lot of people that died. Over 23,000 people died during the siege in a year. That's horrible. And you can imagine if that many people died, then that little 1,500 that was left had to be in real bad shape when they got out of there. But they held on strong. But eventually, you're down that many people. You've seen that many deaths. And some of them were obviously from fighting too. It wasn't all just starvation or whatever, but a lot of it was. You're seeing women and children die, your animals die off, you're barely hanging on. It's time to surrender. They probably should have surrendered way before that, but they didn't want to do it. The fortifications of the city were raised, and Catholic Mass took place in all its churches. So La Rochelle is down. That means the rest of them are going down too. Upon hearing of this, several other Protestant cities took up arms against the king. Bad move. They should have realized the writing was on the wall. If La Rochelle was not going to make it, they weren't going to make it. But you can't really fault them for wanting to be courageous and fight. It was a fight they couldn't win. But none of them could offer as staunch a defense as La Rochelle. By 1629, all of the Protestant fortified cities were taken by Richelieu. So they're done. They're gone. The fortified cities are no longer in Protestant hands, and Richelieu has achieved his goal, or not to try to get rid of Protestants, not to drive them out, not to kill them all, not to make Protestantism illegal, but just get out of their hands the resources that could make them a threat. So what do you think he would do if he achieved that goal? For some, it would be, let me just go ahead and wipe these people out now. But again, that's not what he was looking to do. Since the Protestants were no longer a threat, Richelieu then issued an edict of toleration for them in both religious and civil matters. So he goes ahead and goes back to the original policy of toleration, but toleration without them having their hands on the resources that they once did. So the Protestants are in a very much less advantageous situation now than they were, but they still haven't been outlawed. And so they're going to hang around. They're not going to get out of there yet. It's coming, but they're not going to get out of there yet. They still have a place in France for them. And Richelieu, after achieving his goal, let kind of live and let live type deal. The next king is going to be Louis XIV, and he's going to be shifting policies. Richelieu died in 1642, as did Louis XIII the following year. The 5-year-old Louis XIV was named king, so his mother, Anne of Austria, became regent. She's going to kind of be in charge in his place. But she didn't want to handle everything, and these regents often didn't. Affairs of state were entrusted to the next cardinal that's going to come into place, and his name was Jules Mazarin. He and Anne retained the policy of toleration toward the Protestants. So far, so good. The toleration is going to exist still, so another little period of time that the Protestants are going to be okay. They've lost some of their power. In fact, they lost a lot of their power, but they're still hanging tough because there's tolerance for them. Louis XIV was 23 years old when Mazarin died. He did not name a successor, so there's not going to be a cardinal anymore. Louis XIV was a hands-on king. He was known as the Sun King, and he wanted to be in charge of everything. He wanted to rule. He wanted it to be his way. And so he was a very strong ruler and did some good things, but also for the Protestants, it didn't end up being a good thing. Though he clashed with the Pope, Louis XIV was not a friend of Protestants. So once again, You see that if there's going to be matters of church and state, if the political power, if the political situation gets in the way, then the church part's going out the window. So Louis XIV should have been right up there with the Pope. He was supporting the Pope. He was a Catholic, but he clashed with the Pope. But it didn't matter for the Protestants. It's not going to help him any. He's still Catholic, but that doesn't mean he's going to support everything the Catholic Church does if it's not going to help him. But he's sure not going to go then and help the Protestants out. He's not going to be a friend of them at all. He saw them as heretics and dissidents and took strong measures to stamp out French Protestantism. So finally, from that line from Henry all the way now to Louis XIV, we see that the shift has come. Henry left the Protestant faith behind so he could be the King of France. He became a Catholic, really probably more in name than an actual belief. But eventually in his family, the Catholic situations are going to come back into play of being intolerant of Protestants. And here's where it will be. And that's going to happen with Louis XIV. He wanted to bring about a reunion. And what that meant was a reunion of getting them out of the Protestant church. The king's measures for achieving the reunion, which that's what they call the conversion to Catholicism, because in their opinion, they all started out Catholic, they left, let's reunite. He had some measures to bring Protestants back. They were diverse, but they started out kind of light and grew sterner as time went on. First were attempts of persuasion and mild pressure, so no big deal, just trying to talk them into it. Maybe, twist their arm a little bit, but nothing bad. And that didn't really do a whole lot. Then the king offered to buy conversions. Well, you think, well, why buy them? Why is he even thinking about money? Not that that's not a reasonable solution for a political person to think of. It's not really reasonable when you're thinking of your religious beliefs, but it wasn't because of that. There was actually a rationale for it. The argument was that Protestants who converted to Catholicism lost their livelihood. If they were pastors, they could no longer be pastors in the Protestant church. And many of them were married or whatever, and they couldn't just go and get religious jobs in the Catholic Church. And even if they could have, they wouldn't necessarily have wanted to do it, and they wouldn't have necessarily been welcomed in to do it. So they've lost their livelihood. There also are going to be those in the laity who lost clients and other means of support as a result of leaving the Protestant church. So in their mind, it makes sense that, okay, it's going to cost you financially to make this switch, so let's make it a little easier for you. We're going to float you some money to help you out. We're going to help you make that transition. Once you get into the Catholic Church, you'll be able to reestablish business ties. You'll be able to find another kind of job to get involved in, whatever that may be. But in the meantime, here's some money to help you out. So it wasn't a straight bribe. It really was more a matter of, let's take away an excuse for doing this. One, very reasonable excuse is, well, if I leave the Protestant church, I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to lose my business. I can't make money. I can't live. So the king is very smart, honestly. He says, well, hey, that's not going to be an issue. We're going to help you out. But really, those things, if you are committed to belief, not just a philosophy of life even, but actually what you really believe God has said the way you should live, money's not going to be enough to bring you out of that. And they found that the policies were not successful. Persuasion, putting a little pressure on, giving money to make the transition, it didn't gain the numbers that they thought it would. So the king thinks, okay, I tried to catch my flies with honey. Now I'm going to go a different route. And he does, and it's not going to be a good route, but it is going to actually be more effective. In 1684, the army was used to force the reunion of French Protestants. This policy of violence was successful. In some areas, tens of thousands were forcibly converted to Catholicism. So they catch on, okay? Being nice didn't do it. Kind of peer pressure didn't do it. Offering them money didn't do it. But if I got the army after them and got a little violence going on, then that did it. Tens of thousands, a bunch of them left, and they came back to Catholicism, and they came to Catholicism. And that's going to lead us to the Edict of Fontainebleau. Finally, in 1685, the Edict of Fontainebleau was issued, abolishing the provisions of the Edict of Nantes and making it illegal to be a Protestant in France. So finally, 1685, the Treaty of Nantes goes away. It hadn't really been followed exactly. It hadn't been followed. Before that, it had not been honored, but it hadn't outright made Protestants illegal. That still was there. Now they are. This Edict of Fontainebleau did that. French Protestants fled in mass. They knew it now. They said, okay, everything else before this we could handle it. We could hang in there, but not this. We're illegal now. So they got out of France. They went to Germany, they went to Switzerland, they went to England, they went to the Netherlands, and some even resorted to going to North America. So there may even be relatives of some of the people hearing this that the reason, at least in some branch of the tree you came from, the reason you're here is because of this or similar types of political or religious persecution that went on in Europe. In fact, probably a lot of us, that would be the case at some point. But this is a direct one that did get people to come to the New World. France lost so many artisans and merchants from this departure that it has been suggested that the economic disruption caused by the Edict of Fontainebleau helped lead to the French Revolution. So one of the causes that possibly could have been the French Revolution was that there was severe economic consequences from driving that many people out of France. Some people that were very involved in the economy and bringing money in and having business going on, they left because they couldn't exercise the beliefs that they had. They got out, and it hurt the country overall. Didn't matter. The ruling power didn't care. And that's another reason for the French Revolution. But this edict actually had a big effect on that. So once again, this is seeing, we look at all this historical stuff and it's easy to think, I feel like I'm in history class and world history class. But the state and the church were so intertwined at this period of time, you really can't understand one without the other. So you see the cause and effect. The religious side of this, it was really a political thing, driving these people out. Eventually, it's going to lead to a situation in France that's not a good one for a lot of people, and the French Revolution is going to come a part of it. Now, does that mean that this caused the French Revolution? Well, no, there's a lot of reasons for it. Obviously, it's not a central cause, but it's one part of what possibly caused it. And one of the causes was the economic conditions, and that was not helped by this. Officially, there were no more Protestants in France following the Edict of Fontainebleau. However, many who had outwardly converted still held fast to their previous beliefs. Some even continued to gather for the celebration of Protestant worship. So none of these measures ever drive people out completely. They don't. You don't want to leave your home. There's a lot of people that they don't ever want to live more than a few miles from where they grew up. And especially, don't even talk about moving to a new town. What about having to leave your country altogether? That's tough. These are people that were natives of France, and they could go back and look at their family history through generations of people in France, and they didn't want to lose that. They didn't want to leave. So they may have said they converted, and they may have gone to mass or whatever, but they really were still Protestant, and they really were still practicing their Protestant faith in secret. Lacking church buildings, they met in open fields or in clearings in the woods. So they would go out where nobody would be around. In such places, under cover of night, all over the country, tens or even hundreds came together to listen to the word, confess their sins, and break bread. So it was small groups. It wasn't thousands, but it might just be 10, 20, 30, 40. It could be a couple of hundred in some places, but they still did it, and it was happening all over the country. And they kept the location of these meetings very heavily guarded secret. They were very zealous to make sure that they didn't get the word out on that. And so the government had a hard time finding these groups. They tried. They wanted to get rid of all of this. They weren't just saying, oh, it's just 10 or 20 people, no big deal. No, they wanted them gone. But they had a hard time finding it. But every now and then the government would find out a place and a time that they were going to meet. And when they did, they would sit back and lie in wait, and they would wait until they felt like everybody that was coming had gotten there. And as soon as they did, they went in. They didn't slaughter them, but they arrested them. The men were sent off to row in the galleys, so that's not any fun. You're going to spend the rest of your life rowing a boat. And the women were in prison for the rest of their days. So basically, it's life imprisonment and hard labor for the men, and life imprisonment, whatever situation that would be for the women. Pretty tough punishment, but they didn't lose their lives necessarily. But, in some ways you think, well, it may have been better just to die than to live the rest of your life like that. Of course, that's easy to say sitting here. But anyway, bad situation for them. And when they got a chance, the government did certainly try to stamp this out, but they weren't able to. Pastors, though, were executed, and children were placed in foster families to be raised Catholic. So there was one group that was executed, and that was the church leadership, the pastors. They would kill them for this. And then the children, they wouldn't have to go into any kind of imprisonment, but they were actually brought into Catholic families so that they could maybe raise them to be Catholic. And they saw the children as an opportunity to get the Protestantism out of there by this next generation becoming Catholic. So very tough times for Protestants in France. But in spite of this, as we've seen, the movement continued. None of these measures ever stamp it out. And it just makes the people that are left in it more dedicated and hardcore, because you're going to get rid of all the ones that are doing it just for whatever reason, cultural or family background, or it's just, I like that church, whatever. Those are gone now. The people that remain are the ones who are, they really believe it, and they really see it as their worldview. That is their life, is what they believe. And so they're going to be strong. And it's not going to be easy for any government to stamp it out. Spain came about as close as you could get, but even they didn't do it completely, but they did get really close. The rest of these places, they couldn't do it. And it's been going on since the very beginning of Christianity, and it still goes on today. There are people all over our world that are dealing with persecution, and in those places, they are not thriving in a material sense, but they are thriving in a spiritual sense. And they're seeing so many people convert to the faith because of the dedication of those that are in it. And it happened this way too. So this movement continued. The king couldn't stamp out what the Protestants started calling themselves, which was Christians of the desert. It's kind of weird to think about the desert in France, but it was there. And they would go out. They called themselves that because that's where they would meet. They would get out into desolate places. They would go out where nobody was around, and that's where they would meet. And they called themselves the Christians of the desert. But that situation wasn't going to remain like that either. There's going to eventually be pushback. You can only push people so far. Those who remained in France saw a radical visionary wing develop. This group claimed the end of the world was at hand. So you got one of these groups that comes around that basically is saying all the bad suffering that we're going through is a sign of the end times. And you see this in just about every generation of Christianity. You're going to see a group that's going to interpret events in the world as being the direct end times. And we see it today too. There's definitely a lot of people in Christianity that would tell you we're living in the last days. And it could be. There's going to be a generation of Christians that are the last days. We just don't know which one it is. And we can go back and look and see that even those first disciples, the very disciples of Jesus, thought he was returning in their lifetime. So it's not unusual, but what they kind of went to extremes with this. It wasn't just we're going through tough times, so maybe Jesus is going to return and save us from this. It was like they were serious about it to the point where they really did think they had down the day and the time he was coming back. Encouraged by announcements of the return of Christ by 1689, some of the French Protestants became more audacious, leading to many being killed or condemned to the galleys. Others were cruelly tortured. So the ones that were kind of hiding out in the background, all of a sudden they get more bold because they're thinking Jesus is coming back. He's about to vindicate us. We don't have to hide anymore. Well, Jesus didn't come back, and they were out in the open now, so it didn't turn out good for them. Then the prophetic spirit turned to armed rebellion. So when the prophecy stuff didn't work out, it became time to let's fight back. This is where the pushback comes. They've been pushed so far. They got pushed to the point that they thought, okay, this has to be the end times that we're reading about in Scripture. So Jesus is going to return. That didn't happen. So the next thing is, okay, we're not putting up with this anymore. And this is unlike, though, the other religious wars we've read about both in France and around Western Europe. It wasn't led by nobles. This was led by those people out in the desert, and they were peasants largely. It wasn't the nobility that was going out and meeting in the woods. No, this was the peasant. This was the lower class. And there are armies of these people, and they have decided they're going to fight back. So there's going to be a different situation than these other wars we've heard about. When these peasants were not busy plowing, sowing, and harvesting, they gathered in armed bands and attacked royal troops. So they would have to do their work. But when the season was not good for that, or they had time, they got together and they started fighting back. Before marching out, they read scripture, and in the field of battle, they sang psalms. So again, remember we kind of got really hard on the Catholics before about them celebrating death and all this and singing praises when they're slaughtering people. Well, I told you it was going to come back around for the Protestants, and here they are. And this isn't the first time of this with them either, but they are celebrating and praising God for killing who would have been looked at as their brothers and sisters in Christ. Now, neither group thought that the other one maybe was, but they both claim to worship the same Jesus Christ. And they have doctrinal issues, severe doctrinal issues, but they're still supposedly worshiping the same Jesus. And that same Jesus who said, you need to not only love your brother, but your enemy. Now, in his name, they're going out and killing one another. Again, this is terrible. It's a terrible time in history. It goes on and on and on and on. We look at our present day, and so many people complain that they don't feel like things have gone far enough as far as justice and equality goes. And in some ways, you can see some of that being valid. It's come a long way, though. You look back on this period of history, and for this is the 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. It's not that long ago, honestly. And it continued on even after that, where this mentality of if somebody disagrees with you, there's not equality and justice to be shared. It's let me go out and kill them. And if it's in the name of Jesus Christ, then I'll sing a psalm while I'm doing it. We've come a long way from that, thank the Lord. But this was a dark time in history for sure. Of course, we got our dark days now as well. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. These rebels became known as camisards. Since conventional warfare could not put the rebels down, the army followed a policy of razing the areas where the camisards operated. About 500 villages were destroyed, but this only helped swell the ranks of the rebels, with many now being homeless. So when they go out and tear down a village or destroy a hamlet, well, the people didn't have anywhere else to go. Let me just go join up with the rest of the people like me. And they were not joining up in a group of people to, let's rebuild the town. It was a group of let's get back at the ones who took us out, who took our town out. So now the army's just getting bigger by destroying these villages. So that wasn't really a great policy by the government, but it's the one that they went with because they just didn't really have a way of directly dealing with these people otherwise. Resistance continued until 1709 when the last camisard leaders were captured and executed. So it took a while, but they did get them. And you might be thinking, well, that's the end of the story. Well, it's not the end of the story because there are actually other French Protestant groups other than this radical group. And the other French Protestant group is the one that's going to survive through this. Meanwhile, another group came to the foreground among French Protestants. These older leaders advanced a return to the Reformed tradition with a clear and careful exposition of Scripture. So they wanted to get away from the wild, end days prophecy stuff. They wanted to get away from the armed rebellion stuff, and they wanted to get back to the Reformed tradition that they kind of had been brought up in. And so the group that survives is the one that's going to do that. The leader of this group was Antoine Court. In 1715, he organized the first synod of the French Reformed Church. So he's going to be the voice of reason with this group. Court advised his followers that civil authorities should be obeyed in all matters except when they demanded something that was contrary to the Word of God. That is the traditional Reform movement way of looking at this and how to deal with the state as a Christian. This would have been right along the lines of what Calvin had to say and those that followed him. So they're going to take this policy that we're not going to be enemies of the state. We're only going to show resistance if the state demands something that's contrary to the Word of God, which still left plenty for them to have to be against the state with, but it was a different attitude than what you saw with the radical group. 10 days after the synod meeting, Louis XIV died and was succeeded by his 5-year-old great-grandson, Louis XV. So maybe things are going to be better with him. The new government under the regency of Philippe d'Orleans continued the religious policies of the previous reign. So it's not going to be better with him. They're going to still want to get rid of the Protestants. In 1726, a seminary in exile was founded in Lausanne, and that's in Switzerland. In 1729, Court himself moved to Lausanne, where he became mentor to an entire generation of preachers. So Court got out of France. He goes to Switzerland. He's going to be at this seminary in Lausanne, and he's going to be a big-time mentor towards people that are going to come out of there for a long time to come. So he really has a big influence on those Reformed Protestant pastors that came out of that seminary. Persecution of Reformed Protestantism in France continued until 1787, when Louis XV finally decreed religious tolerance. So it took that long, but finally they're back to the tolerance policy that they had before. And it took them a while to get there. You think, man, that is very close to the 1800s. And again, we look back on that being a long time ago, but honestly, in the scope of human history, that's not that long ago. That struggle, like the 30 Years' War in Germany, produced in many a distrust of dogma and dogmatism. So that idea of moving away from religious things being what drives you and your worldview, and it might be more compartmentalized and questioned, is going to take place here as well. So it happened in Germany and the surrounding areas because of the 30 Years' War. People got tired of the wars, and they looked at religion as, well, if all that's going to do for me is just put me in another war, then do I really need it? And if I do need it, does it need to be the main thing in my life? And many of them came to the conclusion of, no, it doesn't. It can be in the background, or I can get rid of it altogether, and I can certainly question it. Well, here in France, that happens as well. And that's going to be the growing sentiment throughout Western Europe. During this period of persecution and resistance, minds were shaped that would later espouse the ideals of the French Revolution. So definitely the church, the religious struggle between Catholics and Protestants in France is going to have a big, big bearing on the French Revolution that's coming. We'll, of course, look at that again in the future, and as well as several other things that are going to happen in France as we go through this. But for now, that's all the time we're going to have today. Next week, we're going to start what I'm reasonably sure is going to be at least a two-parter, and that is on Puritanism. So big issue when it comes to the United States. You probably ever wonder, when are we going to get into the New World? When are we going to get into the New World that's coming? Well, we're going to get there. And in order to get there, we've got to set up these religious groups that are going to be moving to the New World that will become, I said the United States. Puritanism definitely is going to go extend into that, but it's going to start as colonies in a new world. And it's going to have a big impact on it. So we'll get there, but we'll start into that. I think you'll find it very interesting. So I hope you can come back and be a part of that next week. Thanks for taking time to listen to this today. God bless.